Experience and Substance by Witt, or is it Witt? Henry Parker, 1885 to 1949, a work in metaphysics and value theory, first published in 1941. The principal ideas are: experience as something concrete and given is existentially ultimate. In the experience of the self, we have an illuminating sample of reality. What we regard as physical objects, quite different from our sensations, are actually constructions. Integrating sensory data and meanings. The generic concepts of being derive their sense from the given characteristics of experience. David Hume's analysis of causation is inadequate, for it fails to take into account the critical role of volition in influencing action. Substances cannot be reduced to their characteristics. They are relatively independent, have causal efficacy, and endure through change. Space is a manifold of actual and possible relations. Time is a term for events and their coming into being and ceasing to be. The self is best understood as present in the focal self and as having come out of the matrix self. This was published in 1941, remember? Nothing to do with the Matrix. Anyway, Experience and Substance is characterized by its author as belonging to the tradition initiated by Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, recast by Berkeley, Leibniz, and Fichte, enriched in our more recent times, in the 20th century, by the insights of James, William James, and Whitehead. Its argument is along the lines of what is called speculative empiricism, in which an empirical base is a point of departure for suggestions and inferences. The resultant point of view is labelled idealist, finitist, and monadistic. Quite naturally, there is a running polemic against materialism in its various forms, old and new. This polemic is of special interest since it brings out in a sharpened way Parker's own principles. When we get these clearly before us, we'll soon realize how logical the development of his thought is. Essentially, Parker's thesis is excuse me, I'm still suffering a bit. Essentially, Parker's thesis is that experience is something concrete and given, is existentially ultimate in the experience of the self, we have an illuminating sample of reality. He denies that the verb exists has application in any meaningful way to anything other than ingredients of experience, such as sensa, the given elements of sensation, thoughts, desires, satisfactions, frustrations, which I'm feeling right now at the moment, within the circuit of selves or monads. On this foundation, the author builds the framework of what he calls an omega system having eternal status. The analogous with the theses of Whitehead is evident, though Parker is opposed to the Platonic base in the latter's position, being himself more Aristotelian. Both, however, are theists and opposed to what is currently called naturalistic humanism. Experience in Substance is a careful discussion of related topics, beginning with a definition of subject matter and taking up generic problems in succession. The book is quite reasonably written, with a vivid, concrete style, and technicalities are translated as much as possible into their empirical bases. Parker's training in aesthetics and his wide culture have drawn upon to illuminate his more abstract arguments. Realists and materialists will find in this book analyses which they cannot ignore. There is competent familiarity with the modern logic and mathematics, as well as with physics, biology, and psychology. Parker was a graduate of Harvard University in the days of its outstanding teachers in philosophy. Quite different from today, in fact. And one observes something of the range and spirit of Josiah Royce. See my video on Josiah Royce. This is a mature book reflecting years of careful thoughts and decision. There are few philosophical issues which are not explained in this volume. Not explored in this volume. If only they were explained, that would be a different matter. The examination of time, relations, and causality is perhaps particularly outstanding. As an unashamed metaphysician, Parker was concerned with the eternal and its relation to time and change. This framework is somewhat similar to that of Whitehead. Both were opposed to positivism. Parker wrote, and I quote, "The traditional conception of the province of metaphysics was defined once and for all by Aristotle as the study of being as being." End quote. Ontology is a transcription of that dictum. It is worth noting that Parker differs from Whitehead and Russell in seeking to reform the category of substance. Parker believed that metaphysics is maligned when it is associated with the transcendental or quasi-unknowable. It consists of necessary or foundational beliefs. It involves a catharsis of prejudices and analyzes what people often consider obvious, the nature of physical things and of other minds. As a matter of fact, Parker, like Bishop Berkeley, considered the things of common sense and science to be phenomenal constructions. He was well aware of the role played in modern thought by theory of knowledge, and he moved in the ambit of British empiricism and Kant. He mentions critical realism, but does not consider it critical enough. In his account, Parker regards sensations as being at one in the mind of as being at once in the mind of the percipient and external to the mind as control, thus constituting a sort of boundary between monads. Contrary to Leibniz, Parker argues that monads are causally related. The result is somewhat akin to naive or presentational realism. In fact, Parker makes much of the inseparability of so-called primary and secondary qualities as features of experienced qualia, in this resembling Berkeley and Whitehead. But the question is, of course, whether the properties we ascribe to things are mere transcripts of sensory qualia. Parker's view takes things to be constructions integrating sensory data and meanings. For Parker, idea and object are capable of literal confrontation, both being experienced. Concepts apply to sensory data, which demand interpretation, and some datum is always at the base of the concept. In fact, Parker's theory of universals is to the effect that they concern the genetic features of the given. This position is in accordance with the traditions of British empiricism. In Parker's empirical metaphysics, the connections of all discourse with the given in experience is made explicit. However, the emphasis is upon those generic concepts which grasp the most fundamental stratum of being. These are called categories and concern the basic characteristics of whatever exists, such as space, time, relations, causality. In all this, Parker was opposed to what we may call a priori rationalism. There are many insights in his speculative enlargement of empiricism. Perhaps realistic corporealism could profit from them. Certainly, one may find much that is admirable in Parker's suggestions about the generic characteristics of the cosmos. Concepts are responsible to the evidence of the senses and to the indications of life as lived. Following Bradley, Parker speaks of centres of experience. These are his monads. In a way, to be is to experience. This approach fits in logically with Bradley's denial that anything but idea is thinkable, and with Whitehead's rejection of vacuous, which is to say, non-sensuous actualities. The centricity of centres rests on activities such as symbolism, conception, and volition. In his treatment of these activities, Parker supplements Hume and Berkeley with Brentano. Here the Aristotelian tradition again enters. Much is made of symbols and meanings as additional to sensations, but Berkeley's framework is retained. Conception is an activity of the self which finds expression in belief and in description. Volition is the guidance of experience from within. In criticising Hume's treatment of causation, Parker made much of volitional control. We can control our actions and affect other persons. He suggests that Hume was still influenced by Cartesian dualism in his rejection of volition as a true cause of movements. Volition is the guidance of experience. Symbolizing, conceiving, and volition are integrated, although anyone may be dominant for a time. A sensation is an event rather than an activity. Here Parker diverges from Brentano on the one hand and from G. E. Moore on the other. At one time at least, Moore described the consciousness as able to be directly aware of non-mental data. Parker regarded this as mythical and interpreted sensations as mental events encompassed by activities, and he argues that Brentano overdid the emphasis on reference as a mark of the psychical. He refers to the serial dimension of sensory qualia as a mark against the polarities of conception and volition, such as acceptance and rejection. To avoid the pitfall of a shut-in mind, the author appeals to the thesis that sensations are on the boundary between minds and nature. Here we intuit control and counter-control. At the human level, one presses another's hand in greeting and the pressure is returned. Such communication is more basic than the argument from analogy. Language develops within this context of intercourse. And not the good kind of intercourse, anyway. The strength of the... I suppose that does have its own language. Oh yes, moaning. Where was I? I've got a sore throat. But I crack on. The strength of the Aristotelian tradition in Parker has already been mentioned. It now appears in his defence of the category of substance. His empirical recasting does not go as far as either Russell and Whitehead went, or the logical positivists. What he does to modify the logic of Leibniz, by developing relational statements. His monads have causal windows. I know not much that'll make sense if you haven't read Leibniz, but anyway. I think I've done a video on Leibniz. If I haven't, I will do one. There are, he argues, 4 important features in the concept of substance. The first is to the effect that nothing can be reduced to its characteristics. The second concerns relative independence. The third bears on causal efficacy, while the fourth calls attention to conservation or endurance through change. A polemical note of some interest enters here. Parker argues that the materialist who identifies the mind with the brain, must hold that experience is a predicate of the brain. It is evident that there are linguistic traps here. People do say that a man has a good brain, or a woman has a good brain, much as they say that he or she has a good mind. But how does this functional goodness manifest itself? Parker argues first that materialism involves an enlargement of the notion of matter, and I quote, "It is so enriched that it no longer means matter." But that is an appeal to definition. Parker treats the notion of emergence and levels with respect. His treatment of levels. I'll start again. Parker treats the notion of emergence and levels with respect. His treatment of levels of causality is not at all bad. As against pragmatism, Parker accepts a picturing notion of truth, a kind of correspondence theory. The pertinent question is whether meaningful statements have sensory data as their objects or refer to something beyond the data which is controlling them. It appears likely that Parker had the latter notion in mind, for he was very much interested in other selves. His phenomenalism covers ontological panpsychism. It appears that he rejected C.I. Lewis's two types of knowledge, that which terminates on sensory data and that which is more open and non-determining, as insufficient. To this extent, Parker was a realist, but he was not a physical realist. Material things are constructions, he argues. The Berkeleyan view of perception was essentially held. In considering the generic or fundamental categories, Parker had many valuable insights. Newtonian space is rejected, and space is thought of as a manifold of actual and possible relations and positions. Mathematical points should not be verified. Time is a term for events and their coming into being and their ceasing to be. Duration is a relational term pointing to parallel series of events. Even the matrix self has duration in time only in this sense. The author gives no analysis of the distinction between the occurrent and the continuant, but there is something analogous in his distinction between the focal self and the matrix self. According to Parker, memory depends on traces or echoes of the past. This is the basis of his doctrine of historical truth as eternal. It leads him to a matrix self of the universe which is eternal and to creation. The resemblance to Whitehead's theism is evident. The treatment of relations finds a middle ground between Russell and Bradley. Symbols must not be allowed to get in the way of thought. Ropes or brackets may be better symbols than words. Parker distinguishes between static and dynamic relations and between original and acquired properties. His stress on acquired properties represents his break with Leibniz and his recognition of time in an evolutionary sense. As against Hume, Parker defends the objectivity of causality. Decisions and tendencies are at the foundation of causal sequences. Successive wagering rests on forces in nature itself. Thus Parker provides a metaphysical basis for induction with the idea of initial probability. The treatment of levels of causality is quite in line with theories of emergence. The summary of value theory in this book condenses what Parker worked out elsewhere in detail. Volition and satisfaction are the bases of value as an experience. In this way, Parker links value and experience much as he did Bose&Kay. He is critical of Petrie's formula to the effect that value in any object is in any object of any interest. The concluding chapters are devoted to the consideration of the eternal. Passing by essences or universals as timeless, Parker develops the thesis that there is an ultimate level which is permanent and really highest, and he calls this the Omega system. Roy Wood-Sellers once called it the flaw of being. As a theist, Parker exalts it. He argues that the whole must be more complex than any part. Some interesting remarks are made on constants in nature, such as the gravitational constant and Planck's H. I know that's a rather obscure reference. I might explain it in the comments. These would be, in a sense, a priori, though in a non-Kantian sense. It may be recalled that Sir Arthur Eddington was seeking such factors in a rationalistic way. Science is often more ontologically inclined than positivists admit, and this is something that I keep saying, and I will keep stressing it. So Parker is right here. The topic now shifts in the meaning of the term existence. Parker regards it as involved with the given. To say that this sense datum exists is tautological. Perhaps existence arises as a term in connection with the application of concepts. There are lions, or lions exists, concerns the applicability of a concept to an observable world. The statement involves a terminal statement of the form, "This is a lion." In this work, Parker argues for theism. The mystic may be right in his feeling, in his or her feeling, that he or she is in communication with the eternal. There is a touch here of Hawking's approach. I might give these references, I might mention these references in the comments, so you know where to look. What Parker argues for is the initial probability of the religious view of the world, and he supplements his argument with a pragmatic defence. While sympathetic to the arguments of the supernaturalists such as Tillich and Barth, Parker was not impressed by them. They are supports of a tradition. In the last analysis, Parker turns to Plotinus and emanation. God created the universe because of his need for companionship. Parker is frank enough to say that the scientific view of the world is an alternative, but holds that it lacks the recognition of the ultimacy of experience. There are other points which could be examined, for Experience and Substance is a mature book. It is a systematic development of a point of view. It is well written and reflects intimate acquaintance with the relevant literature. It was meant as a conscious challenge to naturalism and materialism, and such debates give vitality to philosophy. I could do with some vitality now, actually. It's so warm here in September. I'm going for a cold shower. See you later.